Do you think you know all the great pharaohs of Egypt? Tutankhamun, Ramses, Cleopatra. But there is one ruler whose name has been so thoroughly erased from history that even the stone at Karnak bears the scars of hammers. A name that for over 3,000 years they have tried to make the world forget. In Egypt, the worst curse is not death. It is oblivion. When your name is destroyed on the walls of temples, when your statues are smashed, when your memory is torn out as if you never existed. This is exactly what they did to Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who challenged the gods, the priests, and the very foundation of Egyptian civilization. But here's what's really scary. Even after thousands of years, his story still seems dangerous. Because he did what no one before him and no one after him dared to do. He tried to erase the entire pantheon of gods and replace it with a single sun disk. So what did Akhenaten do that his own people cursed his name? Why was he even erased from the lists of pharaohs? As if he were a shadow. And why does his legacy still cause controversy among historians and horror among those who hear his story for the first time? Get ready, because this is not just a biography of a pharaoh. This is a story about how one man decided to rewrite the religion, art, and very soul of Egypt, and paid for it with oblivion. Before our eyes is Egypt during the reign of Amenhotep III. It was a true golden age. Temples shone with gold, treasures from Nubia filled the treasuries, and diplomatic letters from all over the East arrived with requests for alliances. And it was this enormous legacy that his son, the young Amenhotep IV, was to inherit. But from the very first days, he looked different. In the reliefs, we see a strange image, an elongated skull, narrow shoulders, but wide hips. He did not resemble the ideal pharaoh, who was depicted as a mighty warrior with shoulders like a god. His body challenged the very canons of art. He ascended the throne around 1353 BC and ruled for almost 2 decades, until 1336 BC. Modern DNA research adds even more mysteries. It turns out that the dynasty to which Amenhotep IV belonged practiced marriage between brothers and sisters for generations. The result? Genetic diseases, deformities, congenital defects. There is speculation that it was precisely because of incest that the pharaoh had serious health and even mental problems. And this is important, because Egypt got an heir not just after a golden age, but perhaps already broken by genetics, with his strange worldview and vision, which would soon turn the whole kingdom upside down. We see a young pharaoh who has just ascended the throne, and the first thing he does is declare war not on his neighbors, but on his own gods. Amenhotep IV declares, Amon no longer exists. There is only Aten, the sun that everyone sees. What happens to an empire when its gods are eliminated by a single decree? It sounded like thunder from a clear sky. Think about the scale of the problem. The temples of Ammonius owned 1/3 of all the land in Egypt. It was a real state within a state. In Karnak, the temple had tens of thousands of slaves, hundreds of thousands of head of cattle, and gold treasuries that rivaled the palace itself. The temples of Ammonius controlled 1/3 of all the land. It was a state within a state. And then a pharaoh appears and says, all this is futile. Your god does not exist. For the priests of Ammonius, this was not just sacrilege. It was a blow to the very system of power. For whoever controlled the god controlled the people. What Amenhotep IV did would later be called the first heresy in the history of Egypt. He didn't just raise the sun above all other gods. He began to build a new religion that could destroy the old order that had lasted for thousands of years. The picture of Egypt before Akhenaten is simple. Art is eternity. The pharaohs are depicted as equally powerful, godlike, without a single wrinkle. Sculptures are not portraits, but ideals. Everything serves one purpose: to show that power is immutable, that the order of the world is eternal. And then suddenly Akhenaten appears. In his reliefs, we see something completely different. The pharaoh sits with his wife Nefertiti, holding their children on his lap. The sunbeams of Aten extend symbols of life to them, as if they were a special family chosen by the god himself. It was a shock for the Egyptians. For the first time in official art, it was not grandeur that appeared, but humanity. We see kisses, tenderness, even tears. In one scene, we see the death of a little daughter. The mother is in despair, the nurse is holding the baby. This is unheard of. In a culture where death was covered up with symbols and myths, Akhenaten allowed tragedy to be shown as it is. When art stops lying, can power survive? Think how shocking this was for the Egyptians, who were used to seeing only godlike rulers. It was more than art. It was propaganda. Each bas-relief said, "The gods are no longer for everyone. Aten gives life only to me and my children." And for people who had prayed to Osiris and Isis for thousands of years, it was a shock. For the first time, art was no longer about eternity and became about one thing. Imagine the scene: Thebes, the heart of ancient Egypt. The temples of Amenhotep are gigantic, their walls gleaming with gold, their treasuries overflowing. The priests are not just priests, they are lords of vast lands, armies of slaves, and countless riches. In the 5th year of his reign, around 1348 BC, Akhenaten took a step that shocked the entire country. He leaves Thebes, the heart of the old religion and power, and decides to build a completely new capital. In the middle of a deserted desert, he orders the construction of Akhenaten, horizon of Aten, a city that was to belong only to him and his god. The construction was grandiose. Tens of thousands of workers, giant stone blocks, but not the usual ones. Akhenaten introduced a new technology, small standardized blocks, talatats, thanks to which the city grew at an incredible speed. Akhenaten was built from talatats, thousands of small blocks. The city was built from a quick construction kit, right in the desert. In just a few years, a palace, temples, and residential quarters were already standing in the desert. Is it possible to build a capital faster than people realize what they have believed in? But the price of this construction was terrible. The old temples remained empty. The rituals that, according to Egyptian beliefs, maintained the order of the world were no longer performed. The gods who held up the sky and the earth were ignored. And for ordinary people, it was like the end of the world. The texts of that time convey a sense of fear. The sun rises, but will it return tomorrow? People lived in anxiety because the old order had been destroyed, and the new one seemed cold and incomprehensible to them. So Akhenaten fought the priests not with a sword, but with silence. He left their temples to rot and their gods to remain silent. And the whole country had to live with the feeling that invisible forces no longer held the world together. Akhenaten's new temple was unlike any other in Egypt. Forget the dark halls with columns, where only priests had access to the sacred image. There was no roof here. The temple stood open, under the open sky, so that everyone could see the god directly. The sun disk that spread its rays across the earth. Temples without roofs. God, under the open sky. No intermediaries. This was the main shock. In ancient Egypt, priests always stood between people and gods. They knew secret words, performed rituals, and made sacrifices. Now, none of that was necessary. No secret rites, no sacred processions. Only the sun shining on everyone. It would seem to be a democratic idea, but in fact, it deprived people of everything that gave them hope. After all, Isis and Osiris, the gods who promised life after death, had disappeared. Anubis, the guide to the afterlife, disappeared. All the defenders and familiar faces of the pantheon disappeared. And the people were faced with the cold truth. Death is the end. And life is only what you manage to live under the sun of Aten. For the Egyptians, it was a shock. They had grown up in a culture where death was only a transition, where funeral texts guaranteed eternity. And now they were left alone with reality. And this whole new religion had only one main function: to emphasize that Akhenaten himself and his family were at the center of the universe. At the center of the cult of Aten was not only an idea, but also Akhenaten's own family. And this is where one of the most disturbing pages of his life opens. The pharaoh had 6 daughters, no sons, and for Egypt, that meant disaster. The dynasty, which had held the throne for over a century, was in danger of disappearing. And then Akhenaten began something that was unheard of even in ancient Egypt. Try to imagine a 16-year-old girl, already wearing the queen's crown. We see strange scenes in the reliefs. His eldest daughter, Amenhotep, receives the queen's crown at the age of 16 and becomes not only the heiress but also the official wife of her father. Her younger sister, Akhenaten, at the age of 13 to 14, also appears next to him as his wife. And this is not the fantasy of archaeologists. The images clearly show that they are wearing royal crowns, and sitting on the throne next to him. Was it monotheism or the cult of one family? But the most tragic story is associated with his third daughter, Akhenaten. She died at a very young age. On the walls of her tomb, we see a scene that impresses even modern researchers. A mother in tears, a child in the arms of a nurse, the grief of the whole family. There is speculation that Akhenaten died during childbirth, and the child's paternity is attributed to the pharaoh himself. For the ancient Egyptians, this was a double taboo, both blood relations and the death of a princess at a young age. But the reliefs make no attempt to hide the tragedy. On the contrary, it is shown publicly as part of the cult. This once again emphasized that life and death, love and power all boiled down to one family. A family that the people were supposed to perceive as the sole center of the world. But while the cult became increasingly focused on the royal family itself, outside Akhenaten, the whole world was falling apart. Vassal kings begged for help, and the empire's borders began to crumble. While Akhenaten was building his paradise in the desert, the outside world was falling apart before his eyes. Egypt, which had been a superpower under his father, was now losing allies and territories one after another. In the Amarna letters, an archive of diplomatic documents preserved from that time, we read the desperate words of the vassal kings. "Send archers, Pharaoh. Our cities are burning. We will perish without help." And what does Akhenaten do? He remains silent. No troops, no support. Imagine the despair of these rulers. They wrote letters into the void. The Amarna letters plead, "Send archers. Our cities are burning." And the response from Akhenaten was silence. As a result, enemies are tearing the empire apart. Syria and Palestine, which had been under Egyptian rule for decades, are spiraling out of control. In the south, uprisings are beginning in Nubia. And for the first time in centuries, Egypt looks weak. For the common people, this was further proof that the pharaoh no longer protects the country. He sits in his Akhenaten, surrounded by reliefs of the sun disk, while the real world collapses. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the guarantor of Ma'at, the world order. But when order was destroyed, the question arose, was he really still the pharaoh? The city of Akhenaten, which Akhenaten proclaimed the horizon of the sun, began to decline during his lifetime. Workshops closed, neighborhoods emptied. People left the desert and returned to the old cities, where priests lived, but it was safe and understandable. Art that once seemed revolutionary became caricatured. In the bas-reliefs, the pharaoh looks strange. Narrow shoulders, feminine hips, breasts. For his contemporaries, this was not just a new art form. It was a perversion, a symbol that the ruler himself no longer fit into the order of the world. Akhenaten found himself isolated. His paradise in the desert did not live up to expectations. He had no son to succeed him. He lost the support of the people, and the old gods returned to the consciousness of the people, even though their names were still carved out of the temples. Once he wanted to create a new eternity, and he was left alone in a ghost town that was already preparing to become a ruin. In the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten's story ended as suddenly as it had begun. His death is shrouded in mystery. Some speak of genetic diseases that slowly destroyed his body. Others suggest exhaustion or even a conspiracy at court. But the fact remains, the heretic pharaoh died, leaving behind a divided country and a ghost town in the desert. Power passed to Nefertiti and later to the young Tutankhamun. And the first thing the new rulers did was to bring back the old gods. The temples came back to life, the priests resumed their rituals, and the people breathed a sigh of relief. All of Akhenaten's reforms were declared a mistake, a dangerous experiment that nearly destroyed Egypt. His city of Akhenaten began to be dismantled into stones. His statues were smashed to pieces. His name was carved out of inscriptions. He was simply omitted from the lists of pharaohs, as if he had never existed. And just think, for an Egyptian, this was worse than death. His name was carved into dust. His statues were turned into rubble. His city was turned into building materials. And that was the worst thing. For an Egyptian, death was not the end. The end came when your name was no longer spoken, when it disappeared from temples and tombs. And that is exactly what they did to Akhenaten. They cursed him with oblivion. It seemed that Akhenaten's plan had succeeded. His memory was erased, his name was carved out, and the city dissolved into the sands. but time proved stronger than the curse. In the 19th century, archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins of a ghost town. Stones with strange scenes unlike any others in Egypt. Images of a pharaoh with an elongated skull, tender scenes with children, a sun disk stretching out its rays. The name that was to be forgotten forever came back to life, Akhenaten. In the 20th and 21st centuries, science went even further. DNA analysis of mummies from the Valley of the Kings showed that incest did indeed take place in the dynasty. Genetic diseases, disabilities, deformities. All this confirmed the strange images on the reliefs. What once seemed stylized or grotesque turned out to be reality. Today, we see Akhenaten not only as a heretic, but also as a man who dared to change the very foundations of civilization. He tried to create the first monotheistic religion in history. He destroyed the old order and became its victim himself. And here is the strongest paradox. Once his name was carved out with hammers so that he would be forgotten. And now the same hammers of archaeologists are carving out the ruined walls from the sand to restore his memory. Akhenaten wanted to be remembered forever. And perhaps he succeeded, but not in the way he dreamed. So here is the real Akhenaten, not just a weirdo with a strange face, but a revolutionary pharaoh who tried to erase the gods of Egypt and write a new religion from scratch. His life became an experiment that cost the empire its power and him his name. The people cursed him with oblivion. His successors carved his image out of stone. But the irony of history is that it was his forgotten city that gave archaeologists the key to understanding an entire era. He wanted the world to remember only the son and his family. But in the end, the world remembers him first and foremost. His story is a reminder. Even absolute power does not guarantee eternity. Because sometimes the greatest curse is not death, but that your name will be spoken 3,000 years later not as an example of greatness, but as an example of heresy. And if you think this was just a strange episode in ancient Egypt, then wait for the next stories. Because history knows many more rulers whose lives resemble not a textbook, but a real thriller.